just like my mentor Charles Dickens, I'd like to tell you the story of two cities. The two cities are actually called Toronto. So this is Toronto 1, and this is an area in Toronto, it also has a Mercer Street, by the way, that used to be a manufacturing district. It's just right adjacent to downtown. And somewhere in the late 80s, someone had the bright idea to just simply deregulate how we live and work in that area. And that area, that simple decision, just one little stroke of a pen, has completely transformed that neighborhood. Toronto is beautiful because we do a lot of this. So that's a building that was my former company. And prior to me, it was, what we would gently call the Schmetter district. And before that, it was the Signal Corps in the war and so on. This is a building that's really paid for itself. It's over 100 years old. And when we renovated it, it looked like this inside. Now it has some pretty interesting companies that work there. But if you just look at these three, one which deals with global warming, another which deals with design thinking, and a third about urban strategies, you see that these three companies, just these three alone, if they bump into each other every day, as we do, can easily change the world. So this is what it looks like inside, beautiful natural light. This is what it looks like downstairs. There are coffee bars, there are art galleries, there's free art. And there's a street just nearby called Queen Street. Anyone who's been to Toronto has probably seen Queen Street. Wonderful wide boulevards, lots of action, just a very pleasant place to live and be. So I would call this a sustainable, resilient, human, and innovative environment. And it is. Within a 2 square mile radius of where I work, probably a few % of Canada's GNP is generated. I'm not exaggerating. Let me talk about Toronto too. So back a while ago, we had this chance to take the railway lands, which really span a very broad part of Toronto, right adjacent to downtown. And instead of looking to Chicago for some great ideas on what to do with waterfronts, we decided to build this. These are a bunch of towers. They're essentially bedroom communities within a city. They're terribly built. The walls are very thin glass. After about 5 years, they start falling out, the pieces of glass. They're energy inefficient. And in a sense, there's nobody in those buildings who knows who their neighbors are. So in the sense of we're not alone, there are a lot of people who are alone in those buildings. And that results in sort of antisocial behavior. Here's what it might look like downstairs, and who would want to hang out there and save the world? So this is what I call not sustainable. It's not resilient, it's inhuman, and certainly no innovation is going to come out of those buildings. And it's absolutely true. Here are two parts of Toronto where one is a massive generator of value, a fantastic, resilient community, and another which is just the opposite. This is actually everywhere. I mean, in New York, we can point to the resilient parts of New York and the non-resilient parts. So what is resilience? So for me, resilience is, this is a definition, it's the ability to recover from adversity. So I think of climate change, just to give you this as an example, when I think of climate change, what's it going to do for us? It's going to place us in a world with a lot more volatility, bigger storms, worse things happening, changes in climate, disruptions in people, and so on. And, I think of resilience, and this is my financial background, as hedging volatility. We can't stop climate change, we can deal with it. And the way we deal with it is place those hedges in place. And I'm going to show you that the people who talked before me actually are talking about those particular hedges. So let's take Toronto. Toronto is a place that you always think of as cold. It's actually warmer than New York today. But we know with great certainty that the number of hot days in Toronto will treble by 2030. So what's a hot day? A hot day is something like almost 100 degrees with high humidity. And we, on average, in the past, have only had 20 of those days a year, on average. And so imagine that trebling. That's a massive change in climate and a massive change in how much air conditioning we'll be using, and so on. Yet, when we design buildings, like the ones you saw today, we design them as if the past is going to repeat itself. So that's a word out to the architects around here. So electricity demand, we know, is going to oscillate quite tremendously, higher and higher peaks. We're going to have, each peak raises the cost of electricity and infrastructure dramatically. So if you take 10% off the peak load in Ontario, you will save 40% of the cost of infrastructure. Weather will become much more extreme. We've seen, extreme weather, and I'll give you some examples. This is Toronto on a good day, like the one, it actually looks like that today. This is October last year. And this is Toronto in July of this year, where we had a 1 in 100 year storm, which seems to occur every year. And that storm, whoever thought of a storm like this bringing the electricity system to its knees? What happened was the storm flooded a couple of generators and generating stations, and we came within a thread of losing all electricity in Toronto. There was just one thing holding the whole system together. And it caused a huge disruption in the city, a lot of blackouts and so on. But what happened on that day was quite amazing. The next day was a very hot day, very hot and sunny. And I remember there, it's about midday, and there along comes, people, doors open in big department stores, just pumping cold air into the hot streets. And we were just about to lose all electricity. So you think, well, we could have the greatest, most beautiful buildings in the world, but if behavior doesn't change, nothing will be resilient. So I'm going to talk about behavior, which we think of as the untapped resource. But let me tell you how not to influence behavior. This is a wonderful example of what not to do if you don't want to be resilient. This is perfect. So this was the message I got. It's pretty hard to read from there, but this is the message I got from Toronto Hydro and the City of Toronto at 12 noon, roughly, when we were just about to lose electricity. We had this peak alert, and it was a very hot day, so we hit peak. And I was standing in Yorkville, a lovely area of Toronto, and next to a store, which is supposedly a green store, and the doors were open, and they were pumping cold air into the street. So I texted the CEO, and I said, you know what? You want to lose your brand? You're doing it. Just change it. And he actually did change it. What they sent me from the City of Toronto was this wonderful message. We're very polite in Canada, so there's a dear sir. Attached to this wonderful message is a couple of PDF documents, and if you really read them, if you open them and you really read them, you'll discover that you should be turning your electricity down. So if you did open that PDF, you got this long, actually very polite letter from the Chief Conservation Officer that told you why you should be switching off your air conditioner now. So clearly, you're not going to do much with reactions like that. So what do we do in case of a peak load problem? It's not very unlike what do we do in case of a storm? What do we do in case of a Sandy? Are we prepared for that? Electrical outages, and so on. Well, thank God for the firemen in our midst here today, because they know how to deal with this. And think of the most simple things we could do that would set us up to be more resilient. The fire people know how to do this already. Every time there's a fire, it's a different fire. It's not exactly like the one before. But they sit there practicing for that next fire every day. And in some sense, we need fire drills built into our system. So, for example, in case of peak load problems, it's quite easy in today's world with software and text messaging and the like to actually get people to spread that load out of peak. And the way you do it is by rewarding them appropriately. So let me get to the social side of resilience. Here's the blackout in 2003. One little butterfly flapped its wings in Ohio and the whole system came down. That includes Toronto. Toronto, which usually wastes a lot of electricity, looked quite different that night. But guess what we did? I remember I was part of that. When the lights went out, we had blackout parties. And people came down and, got downstairs, rigged up a gramophone, and life was happy. There were all sorts of people out of the blue just got out where traffic lights were not working and directed traffic. Let's go to another city called New York, and I'm going to show you the tale of two cities. New York in 1977, the blackout was quite a disastrous event. And New York looked like this. I don't know if you remember what New York was like in the 1970s, but it was quite a difficult place to live in. I was here, and there was chaos, a lot of chaos. This is New York in 2003 when the next big blackout hit. And one thing we know about risk management is blackouts are going to happen again. Okay, it's like fires are going to happen again. We don't know when and where, but we should be prepared. And guess what happened in 2003? People in New York got out and helped each other. Now, what's the difference? It's the same city, same blackout, same kind of event, same type of event. Well, New York in 2003 was a much nicer city to live in than it was in the 70s. New York had many more engaged citizens and much more infrastructure for engagement. And in fact, what's wonderful about Margaret and her team is what you're doing in the city is absolutely spectacular. What's happening in Times Square and on the bike lanes is the way you create resilience. And what's happening on your roof is the way you create resilience. Let me give you another example. Here's New Orleans versus Calgary. Not totally fair comparison, but New Orleans in 2005 got hit. And that's what it looked like. And that's what it also looked like. Sharpshooters on bridges stopping people looting. Is that Baghdad or is that New Orleans? So in Calgary this year, we had a superstorm, and the entire city was brought to its knees. There wasn't a single bit of electricity in all of downtown. This is like the Texas of Canada. But that's the tweet message that came from the mayor, who's a very engaged person and has a very engaged town. This is 2 weeks before the biggest event in Calgary, which is the Stampede, and that's what the main stadium looked like. And a week later, these are private people, contractors, not a single dollar of government money, getting together to get that stadium ready for that, and it opened up exactly on time. 2 weeks later, they had this Stampede. So it's not hard to see that cities with an engaged population are more resilient. You can have the most fantastic infrastructure. Think of places like Dubai, where you have unbelievable infrastructure. But if those people are not engaged and are not linked in any way, it won't be a resilient environment. So engagement for me is the biggest untapped resource since sliced bread. How do we engage people? Well, we live in a connected world, and if we want to engage you, the individual, we need to engage you around more than just, say, energy or electricity or peak load. We need to think of you and all of what touches you in the world. And what's wonderful today is the data around you, where you drive, how you drive, where your electricity comes from, what your smart meter's doing, is all opening up. And that allows us to bring software to bear to actually engage you on scale in an evidence-based way. I can measure how much you walk today, so I can tell you and reward you for doing walking. So imagine a point system, or a frequent flyer system, if you want to think of it, where on issuance of a point, a sustainable event occurred. Something good happened in the world when that point was issued. And when that point was redeemed, another good occurred. So that during the life cycle of that reward, the world got better, measurably better. Well, that's pretty nice. Each point makes the world more sustainable. And that's what the challenge is. How do we take millions of people, get them to do lots of little things, change their behavior in a positive way, and do it in an evidence-based way? So we do this with software, and I believe this is what we're going to see. We are being measured. The measured me is about to happen in a big way. I'm sure lots of you have Nike bands and Fitbits and so on. But how can we have resilience without health? I didn't hear health mentioned much. And since health is such a big topic in this country, let's talk about health costs. So the average American households are roughly $45,000 in income, and roughly $26,000 in average health costs per American household. This was what you would call not sustainable. So, you know, there's simple things one can do. Exercise is one of those things. We know, lots of evidence here, that if people just did simple exercise every day, walk 30 minutes a day, that would make a huge difference to the health problem. So imagine the US, we're talking a couple hundred million people. Imagine if everyone in the US was somehow motivated to walk 30 minutes a day. And we measured them with Nike bands or Fitbits or whatever it was. Can you imagine what a difference that would make to health costs in the US? Now that's super simple. So I'm going to challenge you, just like the previous speaker, why don't we do that? And we can. So I want to leave it there. That was me when I was a baby. You know?